Right, so I am so angry about this story, but I'm also not surprised by it, or how it has come about, as the United Nations itself is now coming under attack by Israel in effect, given that a branch of the UN, in the form of the ICJ, having just slapped down the equivalent of a ceasefire to all intents and purposes on Israel, but instead of stopping what they're doing, they've just gone down a more punitive and sinister route, and it is a route that will directly hit Palestinian civilians the most, those Israel claims, via their Prime Minister Netanyahu at any rate, not to have an issue with. This story broke late yesterday here in the UK. Even the mainstream media are covering it to one extent or another. And that's not too surprising perhaps, since we here in the UK are one of the guilty parties roped into this now, being played like a fiddle it seems. But the UNRWA, or UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Agency for Palestinian Refugees, an agency that has existed since 1949 in the aftermath of the Nakba, has now come under attack and sanctioned by 7 countries who financially support it, and support it through humanitarian aid, because it is alleged that of the 15,000 UNRWA workers that are operating within Palestine, 12 have been accused of being Hamas operatives involved with the events of October 7th. And who are the accusers? Well, Israel itself, of course. It's not like they lie at all, though, is it? It totally smacks of revenge by Israel following that ICJ ruling. The timing of this accusation, nearly 4 months on, is incredibly suspicious. But it is the consequences of these actions, this withdrawal of aid, that nobody is considering. Western nations, notably our leaders here in the UK, who haven't thought this through, have obviously not thought this through. And one of those consequences is going to be a painful realisation for Rishi Sunak personally, at that, in the run-up to the general election this year. Right, so if Israel right now said it was raining, I'd want to check the window, because so many of their accusations, from Hamas command centres in hospitals to refugee camps being hit with the wrong size missile, not that any missile should be targeting a refugee camp, to Hebrew laptops being found supposedly the property of Arabic-speaking Hamas, to all of the rhetoric of there being no innocents in Gaza at all of which have led to that recent International Court of Justice ruling, this latest stunt, as I'm calling it, because it needs investigating independently, because the word of the Israeli Defense Force and the Shin Bet police force are frankly worthless right now, in my opinion, and no right-thinking person, let alone government, should be taking their word for anything, especially now prima facie has been met in regards to charges of genocide against this nation state. But sadly, some Western nations just seem to be so slavishly loyal to Israel, for whatever reason, influence, money, whatever, that they jump at the first sniff of someone acting against them, even now, and are more than happy to take them at their word. This is actually, I think, really sinister, this attack now on the UN aid agency operating within Gaza. It's like conventional warfare, and blowing Gazan civilians up as they have been is no longer permissible thanks to the ICJ ruling. So here's a story about some of the aid workers working in Gaza being linked to Hamas. We'll scream blue murder about that, and our friends in the West will cut off aid. Innocent Gazans still die, but Israel isn't responsible directly. Firstly, UNRWA acted to part ways with these 12 individuals and launched an investigation. That is fine. I would have thought that suspension would have been better. However, I'm not out there. I don't know if a westernised suspension policy would pass muster in Palestine, so I'm not going to argue this particular point. However, if Israel said all UNRWA workers in Gaza were Hamas, would they do the same thing? Whilst UNRWA argue they do this to protect the integrity of their organisation, it in effect hasn't worked, as Western nations line up to withdraw funding from that organisation, seemingly in their unwavering support for Israel, which includes evidently the withdrawal of aid from Gaza, which will see people already 93% of whom are not eating more than once a day, with famine already identified as a real possibility and threat, now a virtual certainty. Let's put this in perspective a minute. There are 15,000 UNRWA workers in Gaza. There are some 30,000 people who work for UNRWA all told. 12 of them have had accusations levelled against them, and those accusations have come from the oh-so-honest and virtuous IDF and Shin Bet. And that's enough to cut off aid to the entire UN agency for 7 Western countries, is it? What a sick and twisted world we live in. It is impossible for leaders even as stupid as ours do not realise the ramifications of cutting off financial and humanitarian aid on this scale, now of all times, in Gaza. Israel have completely succeeded in carrying on killing Gazan civilians as they have, but this time without a single shot being fired, because that is the inevitable consequence of this, or at least one such consequence. There are other consequences our stupid leaders likely haven't considered. Look at who these leaders are, by the way. Rishi Sunak, Genocide Joe, no surprises there. Justin Trudeau of Canada, another populist. Geert Wilders, the hard-right fool with the stupid hair in the Netherlands. Giorgia Meloni, equally hard-right leader of Italy, plus the leaders of Finland and Australia. All right-wing to varying degrees, funnily enough. So consequences. First, there's the consequences associated with how over-the-top this action is. We're talking 12 people amongst 15,000. And you defund the entire organisation. You're talking about 0.08% of all those working in Gaza for UNRWA. People will starve as a direct result of this. We know that famine is already a significant threat, and more of a threat that becomes the longer this pause, as it's being called, on funding goes on. But what are the conditions that you would lift this pause then? Israel giving you the thumbs up? UNRWA investigation concluding, maybe. You take their word for it, would you, given they are the accused? Well, you're all stupid enough to believe what Israel would tell you. I bet this wouldn't be good enough for you, though, until it's good enough for Israel, though. All 7 of these nations have jumped the gun without thinking things through. It's all happened too fast. And when other nations are holding fire pending the results of the UNRWA investigation as to whether they would withdraw funding, that would have been the common sense view, of course. But how long can UNRWA survive without funding, though? That's a really big question, and it's one I'm going to have to park for a minute, because we're in how long is a piece of string territory there at this moment in time. Not a very long piece of string, though, I'm sure. Of course, the obvious consequence is how long can people survive? Barely surviving now. Already we've had instances where people have starved to death in Gaza. That will certainly increase. More will die, and that is on Western hands now as much as Israel's, which brings me to the next consequence of aiding and abetting. Israel is already now in court charged with genocide, the conditions of prima facie having now been met. They have been told to ensure humanitarian aid and infrastructure is restored, but they can now point to UNRWA being compromised by Hamas as to a reason that hasn't been possible. They can point to other countries defunding them as a reason that hasn't been possible. What useful patsies these 7 nations are. What useful idiots to be effectively committing collective punishment on Israel's behalf. Israel can now point to the UK or the US or Italy and say, well, it's their fault, don't blame us. We've taken the word of a nation accused of genocide, that their attackers have infiltrated the UN aid agency out there to the tune of a dozen people and decided that that is ground to suspend all support to the entire organisation. The word idiot just isn't big enough. But if Rishi Sunak needs a big red warning light / klaxon as to how stupid he's been, then this next one really ought to do it, because this one could come back to bite him right in his 5 pledges to the nation ahead of the general election. As we know, there's almost certainly going to be a general election this year at some point, and Sunak made these 5 pledges, didn't he? Which he's failing on badly for the most part, which also isn't news to many people. Now, as we've been observing, there are those within the Israeli government who want the entire 2.2 million population of Gaza removed, and they take the land. A notable example would be the Israeli Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. But where do all these people go? And indeed, many have already left Gaza via the Rafah border crossing, of course. We've seen them doing that. Possibly to stay in Egypt, or possibly to go elsewhere and seek asylum. Do you see where I'm going yet? Well, the UK doesn't accept asylum seekers from Palestine, you might be surprised to know. And the reason for that is that they have UNRWA working out there instead to assist these people. But by defunding that organisation, potentially collapsing it under the Human Rights Act, Palestinians would, in theory, all of a sudden be entitled to claim asylum here. It seems crazy to assume at least some people from the region wouldn't attempt to claim asylum here. It isn't just Gaza either. People in the West Bank would be able to as well. The argument that they wouldn't be entitled to asylum here because UNRWA looks after them would fall flat under legal testing, I'm sure. And I'm also sure there will be human rights lawyers more than happy to take such a case on and test that. Sunak's pledge to stop the boats could well increase them Instead, because he stopped aid over a dozen people on allegations made by a nation that lies with impunity in regards to its own conduct in Gaza, which it holds under occupation, to the point it stands accused of genocide in the World Court now. I didn't think we could have a Prime Minister more stupid than Liz Truss, but Sunak might just have proven it. As much as the media fixate on 12 potential Hamas operatives within UNRWA, though, well, they should focus on more of the 152 UNRWA workers who have died just doing their jobs in Gaza. UNRWA doesn't just provide aid. It runs 22 health facilities catering to 3.4 million visits a year and runs 183 schools. Over 250,000 students, fully 1/8 of the entire population of the Gaza Strip, go to its schools. They run women's centres. They run all manner of facilities. All of that now faces collapse. Netanyahu and his cabinet will be clapping their hands with glee at this because they can't be blamed for everyday life collapsing in Gaza as a result of the fall of UNRWA, should it come to that, thanks to their handy 7 Western nations helping them out and scapegoating them. I've got no more words to describe the stupidity of Western leaders' actions leading up to this. But words are exactly what Israel have had plenty of in response to that ICJ prima facie ruling and the provisional orders handed down in their South Africa case there. Haig schmeig, it's been described as. There's obeying international law for you, isn't it? You can find out what some more of Netanyahu's loyalists, not just he himself, have been saying about the outcome of this initial court case, this initial hearing. Put that in perspective of what their Western allies are now doing, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.